Well, any questions? With nothing further, we'll have you take over.
Thank you, thank you. Have they had a break already?
No, they need it. We don't break.
They don't need a break.
They break on their own.
We finished earlier. Election break, no.
Well, who has not voted? Okay.
That's a rather personal question.
I don't think they're personal questions.
I know.
I hope I made a point of question about only religion and politics. Everybody says you don't talk about religion and politics. The only things we're talking about is religion and politics. Somebody talk about that. What do I want to talk to them for? I want to know what they believe about political order and whether or not God is here now.
100%, yes. Thank you, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to meet you today. My life isn't as fancy as it sounds in the presentation. I also work. It's not like I go surfing the world. But of course, he's right at the same time. It's a very beautiful profession, this one, of teaching that allows you to meet people all around the world. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. Again, in special days for the university, as yesterday we were at the inauguration of the new president of the university, where I met your new dean as well. As you know, Professor Ambrosio, my good friend, is a fan of Professor John Finnis. Does this name ring a bell? I almost brought you his other copy of this book, which is in his office. If you have a small interest in this class, I strongly recommend you go one day to his office and have a look, especially if he's not there, to this other copy, and then you will realize that it has been read around 67 or 84 times by the owner.
I probably read this book all the way through, close to 75 times.
You see.
And I still have problems with chapters on authority and obligation.
Yes, then how can we expect
I'm
students?
not expecting to get that.
I know.
All that stuff. Well, some of it's not necessary, you know, you don't need 100% understanding. Sometimes a 60% understanding is very sufficient.
I know. Well, I had the privilege of studying with Professor Finnis in Oxford. I don't know if Michael mentioned to you that he invited him here to Seton Hall. Did you know this? He told me today how he had to move the day of Finnis's lecture because he got into the wrong airplane and ended up in Houston. I didn't know this would happen to a person, that they will allow you in a flight to Houston when you're going to New York. But then it was 1989, you said?
Oh, 84.
84 when he came here?
Yeah.
Well, maybe in those days they were, you know how they say in airplanes, sometimes the flight attendant will say, okay, if you're in the wrong flight, this is your last opportunity to live. Well, never happened. But in that case, it happened.
The secret to the story is I had to come back and tell the faculty who were waiting for him to arrive that he wasn't going to come because I should have said it, but I said because he got on the wrong plane. But I had to give him some reason. He did. So they laughed. And one guy, positivist, he said, "Well, if he was a positivist, he would have got here."
I don't quite understand the connection between being a positivist.
Well, because positivists are concerned about order and power, and they pay close attention to the worldly idea of law rather than broad transcendental notions that sometimes we lose our thoughts in transcendental ideas.
I see. Well, speaking of positivism, the topic for us today of unjust laws, one of the several ways in which you can approach it has to do with this terrible name, positivism, that is so confusing and so misleading. First, let me give you the summary in Latin of unjust law theory, which you can find in this book as well. Perhaps you're familiar with it. In English, it would go something like an unjust law is not a law. Lex injusta non est lex. This formulation you can find in St. Augustine, in St. Thomas Aquinas, with some variations all the way to the 21st century. And unfortunately, it has become the dividing force between so-called positivism and natural law theory, as we shall see. We shall see why this is unfortunate. The full version is an unjust law is not law, but rather a corruption of law, which in Latin would be sed magis corruptio legis. Why is this relevant for the discussion on positivism? Because the standard view, which I think is incorrect, is that the positivist is the person that holds that an unjust law is a law. But I think it's pretty obvious that an unjust law is a law. You don't need to be a positivist to hold that. So we're going to work around that as well. The other standard reading, or the flip of the coin of this standard reading, which is equally absurd, is that the enemies of positivists, the Professor Ambrosius of the world, the natural law camp, they hold the opposite. They hold that unjust laws are not laws. Lex injusta non est lex. And Finis did a great job about showing how this cannot be so. It would be so silly to deny the legality of an unjust law, for which in the chapter on obligation you dealt with today, he distinguished between what is obligatory in a moral sense and in a legal sense. Again, we'll get slowly into that as well. I would say that this whole short session will be on trying to offer a new interpretation to the idea that an unjust law is not a law. And I will do it using Professor Finis's work as my starting point. And to do this reinterpretation, we need to go back and we need to think about what is the point of law? What is the function of law in a society? Only after we do that, we can come here to this pathology that has to do with non-functioning enactments or malfunctioning enactments, unjust laws. It's as if you were going to study, this is an analogy by Finis, clocks. Well, yes, you're going to have a look at clocks that don't work, but your main interest is a clock that will give you the time. So a clock is there to give you the time. What is law there for? Not in the pathology. And as we know, one doesn't need to be a genius to understand this. Law serves a function in society that has to do with coordinating our efforts as members of that society for the good that we share as a society in ways that are done better, more efficiently by some sort of central authority whose, let us say, for the sake of simplicity, utterances are what we call law. But the claim of those enactments, of those utterances to our obedience, has to do with the notion that what the authority is doing will serve us, will be in our interest. We will be better off if we have law than if we don't. This is when law, like a clock, works more or less reasonably well. This service of coordination provided by the law to the common good is done basically in two ways. In case you're interested, these two are explained in a chapter that I believe you have seen already, chapter 10, in section 7 of chapter 10, where Finis traces Thomas Aquinas' distinction between two modes of derivation, he says, of law from morality. Morality he calls natural law, and law he calls positive law, Finis Aquinas. So basically the idea says, if you pick a given positive law, if it is a functioning one, if it is a serviceable one, a just law, it will be connected to morality in one of these two ways. Every single law will carry those coordination efforts either as a conclusion, a direct conclusion from the first principles of natural law, or as the determination, the concretization of a more general principle. So that, okay, so any just law will be one of these two types of derivation, and when a just law is a derivation of the first type, what you're meaning, what you're saying is that you read that statute, that law, that court decision, and you notice like God in the Genesis, this law is good. What it says strikes me as good. I don't need any further technical elaboration to understand, for example, that if a certain law establishes that all men and women are equal, this is good, not because the law says so, but it strikes me as good. Just to give you an example of this first type of mode of derivation of law from natural law. What's the benefit of having something that is good, like the equality of all persons, to be captured by positive law? Well, it can serve the purpose of spreading the word, making this clear, backing up with sanctions, and providing a case in case of a breach of this fundamental equality in my example. Instead, when I'm talking about a just law that is derived in this second mode, connected more remotely with the first principles of practical reasonableness, or in other words, natural law with natural law morality, then when I say this, for example, this article in the bankruptcy statute is just, what I mean there, it's when I read it, I don't necessarily think this is good, the way I see goodness in the Declaration of a Fundamental Equality, my first example. But instead, the goodness in this case has to do with the fact that this just law has settled a certain matter, for example, in bankruptcy, in a certain way that from the moment in which it was settled, say in 1972, when the statute was passed, forward, now we have some peace, some social calmness, the one we hope we'll have tonight as well, because the law has been determined in a matter in which, unlike the former, there aren't clear answers beforehand. One can regulate that aspect of bankruptcy one way or the other, but here in the legislature in 1972 chose this particular determination, determinatio in Latin. This bankruptcy is an example that also I borrow from Venice. The truth is, as we know, and as we grow older, we know even more, that not all laws are just. This is the reason of today's class. This is the reason of the motto. Why do we have this lex injusta? Well, because St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, they could realize that in the universe of what there is as legal enactments, many are just, but some are unjust. And I'm sure you also see the same in these 2 years or 1 year and a half or 2 years and a half of study of law that you've had. I'm sure that occasionally you have encountered the pathology. Maybe you were studying something of torts, contracts, property, whatever, and you read a certain case or a statute that you find is morally deficient. Now you can put it in a new way, saying it is not a derivation from natural law, neither by way of conclusion nor by way of determination. It's unjust, an unjust law. Now we have divided the universe of laws in the real world between just laws and unjust laws. In a civilized country, presumably, the vast majority of the enactments by an authority that usually will be democratic, democratically elected, rule of law, a constitution, lots of checks, balances, the result will be that ordinarily, 97% of the enactments by public authorities will be morally okay. You may like them more, less, from the policy point of view, but honestly speaking, you will say, okay, but I cannot say they are unjust. They are contrary to morality. But there will always be some that will be. Of course, if you're in Nazi Germany, the proportion is reversed. This is why I made the initial proviso of, Nazi Germany was democratically elected, but it was a flawed constitutional system that allowed for very immoral laws that had democratic support, sadly. So this distinction between just and unjust laws is perhaps the most important aspect of this subject matter that we want to keep in mind. This recognition that some laws are just and some aren't presupposes, accepts the existence of a standard different from the positive law itself that will allow you to tell just from unjust, to separate just laws from unjust laws. This is where natural law kicks in. It's a very old idea. I'm sure you're familiar with the Greek play Antigone by Sophocles, when she, who is the niece of this more or less tyrant king, is questioning his authority, the authority of the enactment of this king, precisely on grounds that, with other words, speak about natural law, a higher law. It isn't possible to talk about unjust laws if you don't accept there is something different from the law itself. Otherwise, how can you talk about an unjust law? And this is why today this idea is having so much vogue again. I was at a conference last week in South Bend at the Notre Dame Law School, where I was surprised to see the conference was on precedent. And I had dinner, having dinner the night before the conference started. And what struck me the most is how many scholars of the younger generation are completely anti-positivists. They all declare themselves moral realists. So, for example, the person to my right, we were talking about when to overrule. When is the Supreme Court allowed to overrule precedent? And she would say, well, what the court needs to look at is at whether the precedent in question was immoral. And I thought, wait, aren't you a lawyer? Shouldn't you first look at whether the precedent is illegal, is contrary to the law, it made a wrong interpretation of the law? In other words, this idea of natural law, that we can judge positive law and say no or say good, now has caught again traction. And some people, like this scholar I just mentioned, they go even farther, which is bad. They think, hey, positive law is not important at all. That's very wrong. Positive law, most times, is what will tell us what is just, because most of positive law, this second time, not this first time, determining, settling will tell us what is just, although it won't be evident, unlike the fundamental equality in my first example. So it is important when we open our head, our reasoning to natural law, not to allow natural law morality to swamp and wash and flood altogether positive law. Otherwise, we should have to close the law school, and instead of law school, we will have only departments of morality, where they will teach you what is morally right about bankruptcy, about contracts, and so on. What about the law of New Jersey? Oh, it doesn't matter. The law of New Jersey doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. And I don't hold this because I'm part of the establishment here. I couldn't care less. I'm not sent here by your new team or anything. It's just that I think this is the right thing. Morality doesn't give us a solution for most of the problems. This is why we need this way of determination. At the same time, it's a great torch that allows us to make the distinction between just and unjust. This distinction between just and unjust goes hand in hand, I'll write it here, with the distinction between central case and watered down versions. Earlier we were talking with your lecturer about this, because we were talking about chapter 1 of this book, and it's in chapter 1 when you find this analysis borrowed from Aristotle, where Aristotle wants to know what is friendship, for example. And he says, well, there are many different realities that go by the name of friendship and that answer to the question, what is friendship? But they're not all equally worthy, valuable. Those in those different relationships are not equally your friend. For example, he says, it is one type of friend, the friend who owes you money. They have an interest in appeasing you so that perhaps you will forgive him part of the loan, from a very disinterested friend who you haven't given any money. Or he says, he marks the contrast between what he calls, I think, something like a cupboard lover whatever that is, like someone that you make love and hiding in a cupboard, that person might be a friend, but it's not the same friend with whom you spend time, open day, chatting about everything. In other words, he's trying to play with the idea that there is a central case of friend and friendship, and then some parasitical, watered down instances in which, yes, there are some elements of friendship, but it's not like fully fleshed. And the same with law. The same with law. So we borrowing from this analysis, just law, where you have an enactment that serves the common good, that can legitimately claim our obedience, is the central case of law. And with this methodology, when it comes to defective enactments, morally defective, unjust laws, you will not say that they aren't laws, contrary to a literal interpretation of the motto lex injusta, non est lex, no. Lex injusta es lex secundum quid, or as Evelyn would say, Evelyn Waugh, in his famous novel Scoop, up to a point. An unjust law is law up to a point. A friend that owes you money and you hold him all the time and he is your friend, but up to a point. You'll never know to what extent he's friend until he doesn't owe you anymore. Same here. Why is an unjust law law up to a point? Why is it law in a watered down sense? Why is it law secundum quid? Well, for starters, it looks like a law. It was gazetted, it was produced by the relevant legislative body or court. It has some goal, the goal may be defective. It was published, and so on and so forth. It's just that it doesn't work well, like the clock that doesn't give you the time. It has some moral defect, which we will have to look at in each case, and then some will have to do, if you look at the board, with a defective derivation by way of conclusion, natural law, and some unjust laws with a defective determination of natural law. This is the general idea of the methodology of central case and watered down versions. I find it very useful for everything to explain any kind of state of affairs in social matters. If I want to know, for example, what is a state? It's a rogue state, a state, or I want to know what is marriage. It's always best to play with this idea that there will be a central case and watered down versions than to exclude altogether the defective block, marriage, state, law, friend. No, they all participate in different degrees with different intensities from the main phenomenon. Now, the way you decide what is main and what is watered down, why is just law the central case and not unjust law? It's precisely, again, the torch of natural law that will tell you, no, this friendship is morally more valuable than that other friendship. This state is more valuable than the wrong state. This just law is more valuable than the unjust. Good. I'm almost there, and then I'll open it to the questions that I'm sure we won't have just maybe people want to rush and go and torture themselves watching the results. Unless you are doing it as I speak, just leave it here. Yes, I'm sure you'd be much worse off. It's more interesting right now, for example, I was just watching the results of the Champions League. Played, but in the US, you wouldn't know about a game called soccer. It's just that, just kidding. In Argentina, it's very important. I only found out here that Inter Miami is now in the final stages of I don't know what with our own Messi. Right.
He's an Argentinian.
Of course. I watched him play once for PSG, the team where he was playing prior to joining Inter Miami. Great. I would also like your take on this now or when I wrap up this. Is there anything you would like to question of what I just said?
No, I think it's a very, very cogent presentation. And this is a chapter on unjust laws. We can define the 4 different types of unjust laws that we identify. But essentially, the point you're making, and you're making it very well, is the idea that natural law is the means by which we judge whether or not a law is abuse of authority or consistent with the reason why we have authority, which is to promote the common good. So the need for an objective set of standards, and that's what natural law is. Objective goods and objective principles, which in the modern world finds difficulty gaining acceptance. But I think what she did was to give us a reason for natural law. That's the means to judge the law itself.
Thank you. Yes, I always thought that it won't carry you very far if you know by heart the 4 ways in which a law can be unjust, which I leave for you to read in the book. If you don't understand, if you don't have a new meaning for this, if you believe that an unjust law is not a law, means that unjust laws are not laws at all, then that won't help very much.
So we might just note here that Aquinas recognized that when Augustine sent this,
yes,
what was meant was the idea that an unjust law does not bind in conscience. Binds in law, and legal obligation is invariant, but moral obligation is subject to degrees. And that notion, no natural lawyer ever really presented the idea that unjust law.
But unfortunately,
seriously was meaning that unjust laws don't exist. Yeah, everybody knows unjust laws exist. But the idea that they're not binding in conscience is the notion that was meant by that phrase.
Yeah, this is what I meant when I said earlier that in the chapter on obligation, you have the distinction between what is obligatory in the legal sense, and unjust law can be obligatory in the legal sense. You breach it, you will receive a sanction. Doesn't matter if it's unjust. And obligatory in the moral sense. In your conscience, you are not bound to follow the unjust law because, as I said earlier, laws have a claim to our allegiance, to our obedience, only when they serve the purposes for which they're there. As for your other point, I of course agree, and at the same time, it's very sad that there has been like a successful orchestrated campaign by, so to speak, the so-called positivist camp to decide that what natural law theory is about the denial that unjust laws are laws. And I know that Thomas Aquinas didn't mean that, but because the words actually say that an unjust law is not a law, well, it was very easy to take it from there. And the consequence of this derision has been that then no one gave natural law a chance, because it was argued, if natural law theory tells you that unjust laws don't exist, then let's not listen to these people. This was a very unfortunate consequence, and one of the great achievements of Professor Finis has been precisely to rehabilitate natural law theory and to offer us an alternative interpretation that has taken us in the first place to remember what is the purpose of law. And then only then we see unjust laws as a pathology.
But I also want to commend you for making a very good point that even though determinations are sometimes not entirely just, we have to obey them because the law itself is so important for promoting the common good.
Absolutely.
So obeying an unjust law is sometimes the only way we can keep respectful law at a level that achieve its purpose of promoting the common good. So that's very good.
Yes, indeed. In that second type of derivation, we can only talk about something that is just after it has been enacted or determined in a certain way. Before that moment, it was neither just or unjust. The typical example that they'll give you, and that it's very trite, is whether you drive on the right or you drive on the left. Before this was enacted or before the custom was established, there was nothing wrong about driving on the left. In fact, in other countries, you drive on the left. But once it's settled, then that is what is just. Not because it is just in itself, contrary to what happens with the first type of derivation and my equality example, but because it has been settled. It's the idea of settled versus right as well. But now let me open it in case anyone would like
Anybody
to
have a thought?
comment or ask or.
Well, I mean, this one is more like a question for you, because I want some like direct application here of principle, practical reasonableness in the spirit of Election Day and also Guy Fawkes Day. So, how do you feel about Javier Milei? How would Finis evaluate his policies?
Well, I don't know about Finnish. We would have to ask him. I think that, well, let me tell you, for some years now, I've been I established a reading group with some students and with a colleague. We initially read the books by, this is an indirect answer to your very controversial question, especially if I'm going to be on record. I need to think what I'm going to say, without lying, as Finnish wouldn't allow me to lie. But we read for some semesters, this was like an extracurricular, the books by McIntyre. I used the one you gave me, the second one. And this year we read Millei's favorite book. That is Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, where basically, and Finnis deals a lot with this book by Nozick, which, as you may know, is a response to John Rawls's theory of justice, published in 1971, Nozick 1974, more or less. So everyone thinks that, everyone who hasn't read the book thinks that Nozick is the foremost anarchist and the anarcho-capitalist, but indeed he's not. His idea of the minimal state navigates in between Rawls to his left, whom he doesn't like, redistribution as the key of societal happiness, and anarcho-capitalism to his right, where Mary Rothbard, another favorite of Millei's, and an economist that belongs to the Austrian school, like von Hayek, von Mises, the minimal state of Nozick is in the middle. So with Milei, you never know if he's with Nozick, where he believes in the state but with limited purposes, which would be closer to the natural law view of the state and of the law, or whether Milei argues with Rothbard that taxation is criminal and this kinds of very extreme statements. Sometimes he makes those, sometimes he's more in the minimal state. I would say that I am somewhere in between the minimal state and Rawls. But let me tell you that Javier Milei has, in the surface, a lot in common with Donald Trump. But on closer inspection, and if you are Argentine and know about Argentine politics, he has a lot in common with a former president we had in the early 90s called Menem. He was part of the Peronist Party. You may be perhaps familiar with the song Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, which I would gladly sing for you. Turn off the cameras. It was sung by Madonna, but she was doing Evita Perón, the wife of Juan Perón, president of Argentina. By the way, you know that there, we in Argentina, we copied the US Constitution. We did it in 1853. The US Constitution, there were only two constitutions out there in 1853, the US Constitution of 1787, 89, and another one. And Argentina copied this one, but there was one thing we didn't copy, and that is that in Argentina, if you get a term as a president, as Trump did here, and then say Biden comes, and then say you're elected again, in Argentina, you can go for 8 terms.
Oh,
Yeah, so 4, nada, 8. In fact, 8, nada, 8. You only need an interval. And then, so now there has been a lot of controversy in Argentina, and people are saying we should have done like the US. I introduced that because people are foreseeing that Milei may stay. I'm sure that you're not altogether happy with the answer. I hope that's the idea.
It was very good. Thank you for taking the time.
okay, so we'll see you next class.
Bye, guys. All the best.
Thank you. Very good.